Gut, sehr schön. Schön, als ihr seid alle zurückgekommen. Es ist ein langer Tag. I will present our forthcoming speaker in English. So unfortunately, Ellen Kellman was unable to be present physically with us or virtually with us. But we are fortunate enough to be able to listen to a recording of her talk, which she provided us with in advance. Ellen Kellman is Associate Professor of Yiddish at Brandeis University, where she teaches as well Yiddish literature and modern Jewish literature. She researches and writes about modern Yiddish literature and literary history, and she specializes in history of the Yiddish periodical press and publishing industry. So I kind of hesitate whether we should discuss right after this talk, or maybe we can discuss both talks together, since Ellen is not here to respond to any of our comments. So maybe we will have a discussion about both talks at the end. Please let me know if you cannot hear audio. One moment.
Writing in Arbeiterzeitung, a weekly paper of the Linke Politician Party in June 1929, literary critic and cultural activist Nachman Maison conveyed disquieting news about the changing nature of the Yiddish reading public in Poland, warning that readers were losing interest in classic and contemporary Yiddish fiction, and that current works translated from other European languages were increasingly in demand by the reading public. Quote, reports that we have been receiving from local Yiddish libraries, publishers, and booksellers tell us that the Yiddish reading public has recently begun to show a declining interest in works written originally in Yiddish. Instead, translations into Yiddish from foreign languages are in high demand and are being read very enthusiastically. One might imagine that this is only a passing fad, but when we look more closely at the state of the Yiddish book market, we're convinced that the Yiddish reader is turning in a new direction, driven by a powerful stimulus, end quote. According to statistics gathered by Literarische Blätter, the weekly literary review that Maison edited, the number of translated belletristic works published in Yiddish in 1928 was equal to that of original Yiddish ones. Maison had reached the conclusion that many readers, especially the youth, preferred to read foreign works because not enough of the fiction being written in Yiddish was of interest to them. In his view, the youthful reading audience for Yiddish literature was made up of enthusiastic but unsystematic readers who hungered for reading material that addressed urgent issues in their lives, such as sexuality and social class. Finding little to engage them in literature originally written in Yiddish, they were turning to translations of recently published European novels, in which they sought, quote, the freshness of the moment, the resonance of events that were essentially important to them, end quote, such as the best-selling works by Rolland, Knut Hamsun, Maxim Gorky, Upton Sinclair, Anatole France, Victor Marguerite, and Henri Barbusse. Translations of foreign literature into Yiddish had been popular for hundreds of years, and since the Haskalah period, educators and intellectuals had emphasized the importance of making European belles lettres available in Yiddish. Maison understood the importance of publishing contemporary works in Yiddish translation, but was worried that foreign literature would soon come to dominate the book market and supplant original Yiddish works. In a series of articles published in the late 1920s, He analyzed the problems of the Yiddish book market and urged that they be promptly addressed. A leading editor, publisher, and literary critic, Maison was a key figure on the European Yiddish cultural scene. As co-founder and editor of two literary journals, Bücher Welt and Literarische Blätter, and as managing editor of the prestigious Kletzkin Verlag, he exerted extensive influence on Yiddish publishing and the reception of Yiddish literature in Poland and beyond. Recognizing that the factors of linguistic assimilation, the world economic crisis, and the growing availability of foreign works pose grave threats to the survival of Yiddish literature in Poland, he pioneered in the effort to maintain the Yiddish book and to nurture a new generation of Yiddish writers. Born and raised near Kiev, Maison debuted as a Yiddish literary critic in 1909 with a review of David Bergelson's novella Album Rucksal. He went on to manage the Kunstverlag, a Yiddishist publishing house in Kiev. In 1918, he participated in founding the Unparteiische Kulturliga, which established a network of cultural institutions throughout Ukraine. After the Soviet takeover of Ukraine and the closure of the Kulturliga in 1920, Maison relocated to Warsaw with other leaders of the group. Re-establishing the Kulturliga in Warsaw in 1921, they focused on publishing Yiddish books, modernizing the system of book distribution, and fostering the informal education of déclassé and working class Jewish youth through a network of Jewish public libraries. Their publishing house, Verlag Kulturliga, brought out 70 titles in its first year of operation alone. Maison co-edited Bücher Welt, the Kulturliga's journal of literary criticism and bibliography. But when the Bund became dominant in the leadership of the organization, he resigned from its executive. He co-founded the weekly Literarische Blätter with Yud Zinger, Peretz Markish, and Melech Ravitch in April 1924 as an expressly unparteiisch publication. The editors soon persuaded Boris Kletzkin, the wealthy proprietor of the Vilna Kletzkin Verlag, the leading Yiddish publisher in interwar Poland, to become the publisher of Literarische Blätter, with Maison as editor-in-chief. In 1925, Kletzkin opened a branch of his publishing company in Warsaw, appointing Maison manager. Widely read and respected, Literarische Blätter appeared weekly from 1924 until shortly before the German invasion of Poland. Although he was deeply committed to nurturing contemporary Yiddish writers and their works, Maison understood that the Yiddish book market could not rely exclusively on sales of classic or modernist literature. For one thing, many young adult readers whose childhoods had been disrupted by the Great War and its aftermath had little formal education, so they were not well equipped to enjoy reading serious literature. Even those of middle-class origin found few options for professional development in newly independent Poland and were obliged to turn to industrial labor. Books were prohibitively expensive for most young workers, so that if they had access to them at all, it was through an öffentliche Bibliothèque, or a public library, that is, one that was supported by a social or political organization. Such libraries had sizable collections of the works of the Yiddish Klassiker, but apparently young adults were not interested in reading them. According to Maison, Peretz's work was difficult to comprehend for those who had little background in Hebrew and traditional Jewish culture, and the Baredevdikkeit of Abramovich's and Shalom Aleicham's shtetl characters did not appeal to city-bred proletarian and déclassé youth. Modernist prose and poetry, such as that of David Bergelson and Hay Leivik, was too sophisticated for these readers to appreciate. Even Yosef Opatoshu's novel In Polnische Wälder, originally published by Verlag Kulturliga in 1922, and which enjoyed sustained commercial success, contain much material that young readers found inaccessible. Maison based his analysis on circulation statistics collected from Yiddish libraries throughout Poland and from subscribers to Reyshe. New work in Yiddish that could appeal to a younger reading audience was urgently needed. But Maison was very discouraged by the state of contemporary Yiddish letters in Poland. In an article entitled Zeit zu machen Cheshbon HaNefesh, Maison decried the fact that in the year since 1922, when in Polish Wälder and Lewick's Der Goylem were published by Verlag Kulturliga, mainly mediocre works, which offered the serious reader very little, had appeared in Yiddish in Poland. He compared the output of Polish Yiddish writers to that of their counterparts in the Soviet Union. Quote, "We have dozens of writers, some very talented, some less talented, working here, but the trouble is that they have no ideational grounding to enrich their work. So each of them writes in isolation. Thus, there is no interplay between them, no synergy, no sense that a coherent literature is being created," end quote. In contrast, according to Maison, there were fewer talented Yiddish writers in the Soviet Union, but there was an elan that resulted from a unified ideological approach to writing. Quote, "How can we explain this difference? It is that the Soviet Yiddish writers are inspired by an idea that stimulates their writing, forges unity, moves and rouses them. It often goes too far, even to the point of enslavement. Literature is required to respond to the commandment of the current day at every moment, and it is very bad for literature when an artist obeys the politician entirely. Only works that seriously and deeply meditate upon life and ideas will endure. But here in Poland, we are suffering from the effects of the opposite extreme. The Yiddish writer has shed any kind of ideational orientation completely and has become a bird singing freely across a broad expanse," end quote. As a publisher, Maison was acutely aware that the market for Yiddish books was shrinking dangerously. Competition from Yiddish newspapers created another major stumbling block for the book market. The practice of serializing popular fiction in the Polish Yiddish press began in 1908 in the newspaper Heint, and formulaic entertainment novels eventually became an obligatory feature of every Yiddish daily. During the interwar period, the book market suffered acutely as newspapers competed sharply with one another by providing readers with a daily diet of shund fiction. This cheap and easily accessible source of entertaining reading matter badly eroded the audience for Yiddish books, so much so that most writers of belles lettres in Yiddish were not able to make even a meager living from their artistic work. Thus, some turned to writing shund fiction for the newspapers to support themselves. By 1929, partly as a result of the competition with serialized fiction, the average edition of a Yiddish book was reduced to several hundred volumes, and it was very unusual for even 2,000 to 3,000 copies of a book to be printed. Such small runs necessarily drove prices up. Since books were so expensive, öffentliche Bibliotheken were the predominant buyers, but they operated on very limited budgets and were under pressure to purchase books in Polish as well as Yiddish, since a growing segment of the population of Jewish school children was being educated in Polish. Maison posed some difficult questions. If those who still read primarily or exclusively in Yiddish had lost interest in classic Yiddish fiction, if modernist writing was either too abstruse or socially irrelevant to appeal to young readers, and since books had to compete with serialized newspaper novels, how could Yiddish book publishing hope to sustain itself in the future? Meisel's partial answer was to publish world literature in Yiddish translation. Most of the works he favored were published by the Kletzkin Verlag or publishing companies that belonged to the cooperative Bicher, which was founded in Warsaw in 1926 by the Kletzkin Verlag and Verlag Central for the purpose of consolidating the Yiddish book industry and introducing modern methods of distribution, both in Poland and abroad. Along with other critics and cultural activists, he decried the poor quality of many translations. During 1929, Meisel intensified his ongoing translation initiative. He published Knut Hamsun's 1890 novel Hunger as part of a series of Hamsun's selected works. Cooperative Bicher reprinted its 1927 edition of the first volume of Jean-Christophe, Rolland's best-selling roman Fleuve. This was a sign of steady and healthy demand, since the earlier edition of 4,000 copies had been considered a colossal figure. In September of that year, Literarische Blätter offered 4 major works by Leo Tolstoy as premiums for subscribers to the magazine. Among other new Kletzkin Verlag publications in December were a drama by Gerhard Hauptmann and a collection of essays by Rabindranath Tagore. If one pages through any randomly chosen issue of Literarische Blätter from 1929, one immediately notices that significant space is devoted to raising readers' awareness of literature appearing in English, French, German, and other European languages. There are articles on the works of Thomas Mann, Henri Barbusse, John Galsworthy, Knut Hamsun, and many others. Meisel also authored a long series entitled Yiddish Literature and World Literature in 1929, emphasizing that Yiddish belles lettres could contribute works of lasting importance to world literature. By far the most significant translated work to appear in Yiddish that year was Erich Maria Remarque's Im Westen nichts Neues. Possibly the most celebrated novel about the Great War, it raised a storm of controversy for both its form and content. Rather than developing along lines of plot, it consists of a series of discrete episodes narrated primarily in the historical present. Critics charged that it read like a journalistic account of trench warfare rather than a fictional one, and were shocked at the novel's expression of futility and profound alienation from the nationalist underpinnings of the war. Im Westen nichts Neues was first published in serial form in Vossische Zeitung in November and December 1928 and came out in book form in January 1929. 1 million copies were sold in 1929 alone, and translations into many languages quickly appeared, among them 3 in Yiddish. The first was brought out in April 1929 by Verlag Zucker in Warsaw. Entitled Affenmeirev Nishtokenayes, it was translated by Pua Rakowski, a well-known feminist Zionist. Its publication was heralded in many Yiddish newspapers and literary journals in Poland, with excerpts, reviews, and interviews with Remarque, but Rakowski's translation was roundly criticized for grammatical, lexical, and stylistic errors, and both Literarische Blätter and its Bundesrival Bücherwelt raised a hue and cry about the need to put collective pressure on booksellers to prevent the distribution of unauthorized translations into Yiddish. A second translation, entitled Affenmeirev Front is Ruhig, appeared in June in Riga, Latvia. It was not until the beginning of August that the Kletzkin Verlag brought out the authorized translation of Im Westen nichts Neues as Affenmeirev Front Kenayes. The translator was the young Yitzchak Bashevis. The cover of this deluxe edition featured an illustration depicting a crucial scene from the novel in which the protagonist carries a wounded comrade for miles on his back. a photograph and sketch of the author, an introductory note, and excerpts from an interview with Remarque precede the text. In 1930, Maison reported that 2 additional Yiddish translations of Im Westen nicht Neues had appeared, and that the 5 translations had gone through several editions, amounting to sales of 30,000 volumes in all. While acknowledging that the extraordinary success of Remarque's novel in Yiddish was evidence that the Yiddish reading public was eager to participate fully in the cultural life of Europe, he was appalled by the chaotic and wasteful state of affairs that prompted the publication of multiple unauthorized translations by publishers desperate for cash. Maison was a pragmatic person who understood that even with Kletzkin's financial backing, neither the publishing company nor his magazine were going to be sustainable unless the reading audience for Yiddish literature continued to grow. He was very concerned about the financial health of other publishers as well, and tried to address their common problems through the publishers' cooperative, Bibliothèque. He realized that both formal and informal education in the Yiddish language was crucial to sustaining the reading audience, but felt that his primary responsibility was to nurture the careers of the current generation of Yiddish writers and influence them to create accessible works that could appeal to young readers. Concluding his June 1929 article in Arbeiterzeitung, he argued that, quote, "It is not only the journalist who must respond to the problems of our time. The artist is also responsible for creating works that engage with the struggles of contemporary life. The artist writing in Yiddish must make every effort to create works that readers will find profoundly relevant and indispensable. Only then will their interest in original Yiddish works cease its decline." End quote. The response of Yiddish literary critics to Remarque's novel was extensive and opinions were mixed. Naftali Weinig published an unfavorable essay entitled Yiddish Literature in Light of the Remarque Translations in Arbeiterzeitung in August 1929, commenting that, quote, "The success of Remarque's book must be explained by the fact that in his rage against the war, he collected trifles at ground level," unquote. This is apparently a reference to Remarque's graphic portrayal of the soldier's obsession with bodily functions. Weinig predicted that the novel's popularity was a fad that was sure to be short-lived. However, in his view, although it was far from being an artistic work, the novel's vogue on the Jewish street had stimulated a lively, creative debate about the nature and direction of modern Yiddish literature and book publishing. Several Yiddish critics, including Weinig, compared Im Westen to the French anti-war novel Le Feu of Henri Barbusse, which had appeared a decade earlier, preferring Barbusse's work for its pathos and more literary tone. Writing in Bicherwelt, Yehoshua Rappaport complained that although parts of Remarque's novel had artistic value, in comparison with the elevated style of Le Feu, Im Westen read like a newspaper account. As did their counterparts in Western Europe, the Yiddish critics debated the question of whether Remarque intended Im Westen as an anti-war novel. Bicherwelt published a triumphant review by Melech Ravitch, in which the writer praised the novel as a pacifist work, but the journal's editorial board saw fit to append a statement to the effect that socialists do not have, quote, "the option of pacifism at any price, and do not curse the sword that brings release and freedom to the people," end quote. Always concerned with how ordinary readers understood literature and how it could best serve their needs, Maison wrote in June 1929, quote, "The literary element is very little in evidence in Remarque's novel, and this is why it has such wide appeal among the masses. The artist has undergone these experiences himself, and this gives his words great power," end quote. The present paper has emphasized Nachman Meisel's efforts to maintain the Yiddish book publishing market and to satisfy the hunger for European literature among Yiddish-speaking youth in interwar Poland. Other cultural activists, such as Hermann Kruk, the director of the Bund's Grosser Bibliothèque, and Eliezer Weiss and Basha Temkin-Berman of the Linke Polizien, also played leading roles in establishing and maintaining Yiddish libraries and programs of self-education for working class youth. As I mentioned earlier, libraries were the main source of books for most readers and were crucial to the viability of the Yiddish book market. In light of the many obstacles they faced, the achievements of these activists were remarkable. Memoiristic writings, such as those found in Yivo's collections of youth autobiographies, document both the hunger for knowledge on the part of young readers and the development of reading communities that supported them in their quest to satisfy that hunger. Thank you.
That was a wonderful and fascinating talk, and I am sure we all regret that we cannot ask the speaker I'm not sure, are we all hearing this discussion?
Which discussion?
Yes, everything is good.
Sharon, you're hearing something else that we are not hearing.
Oh, okay. Okay, I'm sorry.
From our perspective, it's all good.
Okay, I was hearing another Zoom discussion because of another recording that started. I'm very sorry. Okay. So, yes. So I'm very, very sorry. I'm sure we all regret that we cannot ask Ellen Kellerman directly and discuss with her directly about her lecture. And I must apologize to her, even though she's not here, that I forgot to mention the title of her talk, which I will do now, because it is a very interesting title, Reading Rolland in Reyshe and Remarque in Ruzhany, The Hunger for European Literature Among Yiddish-Speaking Youth in Interwar Poland. So I'm sure you understood that this was the subject, but nevertheless. Our upcoming speaker is Joshua Price, and it's a pleasure to present Joshua. Joshua is a PhD candidate in Yiddish studies at Columbia and a lecturer.
I got the degree. That was a while ago, but yeah.
Okay, I'm very sorry. That's the bio that I received, so I'm very sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, yes, I don't know where the bio was from, but I'm very sorry. So maybe you can correct me if there is any other mistakes that I'm making. So you are still a lecturer in Yale? Yes, thank you. His dissertation explores the history of the translation of world literature into Yiddish and in the late 19th and 20th centuries through studies of relationship between translations and original writing in canonical figures, distance readings of translations produced and discussed in and across literary markets, Warsaw, New York, Moscow, and close or closer readings of the shift from pre-Maskilic norms to Judaization of modern and contested standards of fidelity. I do hope I didn't make too many mistakes, Joshua.
Good, yeah.
Okay, so today's Joshua's talk today is entitled Two Yiddish Translations of Mystères de Paris.
Okay, I'm sending something through the chat, which is a handout. I encourage you to go to this, download it, peruse it at your own pace, tune me out. I'll also try to share my screen, but the handout is really for self-directed study. So, okay. I don't have screen sharing. I don't know if that's...
I will make you a co-host. Are you okay?
Yeah. Okay. Among the charges leveled by Shalom Aleichem in his critique, 1888, of the wildly popular and rival Shomer was the latter's failure to honor the imagined synthesis of the term Yiddish-Roman, Jewish novel, then representing Shalom Aleicham's ideal for an autonomous and modern literary art. Declaring that Jewish literature ought to reflect the material reality of the Pale, even as it elevated and dignified it into romance, Shalom Aleichem saw in Shomer's works nothing more than a coarsely Judaized mimicry of French pulp, fodder for housewives gone mad and sentimental. This gendered critique being a mainstay of the French and mediating Russian criticism Shalom Aleichem held by. The clumsy transposition of Parisian melodramas onto the Pale was as much an abdication of the holy writ of realism as a moral and national failure. Debased imitations, a la Wagner, evidence of cultural degeneracy. Particularly heinous was Shomer's claim of authorship for one novel that was in fact a theft, Ruzhany Sue's Les Mystères de Paris, the blockbuster epic in which a swashbuckling incognito prince descends to the urban underworld to redeem prostitutes, offer charity to the deserving poor, vanquish murderers and thieves, and ultimately reunite with his long-lost daughter, herself a repentant young woman of the night. For Shalom Aleichem, a straight Yiddish translation of Sue's novel would have been far less deleterious than Shomer's so-called original work. See page 1. This kind of translation would resist Judaization of the setting and character and make no claims to being an original Jewish work, preserving foreign authorship and an alterity that would broaden readerly horizons without colonizing the Yiddish roman. Shalom Aleichem likely saw some realization of this ideal in Kalman Schumann's Hebrew translation of Sue's novel, Mystères Paris, a blockbuster in its own right. Flying under Shalom Aleichem's radar, however, was the fact that Mystères was indeed translated into Yiddish by Warsaw rabbi and bookseller Yeshua Gershon Munk. See page 3. Munk's translation, published in 1865, 1866, in a single edition series of 5 ephemeral typo-laden chapbooks, has languished since then, apart from a handful of citations in the Grosser Wörterbuch, cursory bibliographic attention from Chona Shmeruk and Nathan Cohen, and an important initial analysis by fellow conferee Naomi Brenner. Only 2 extant copies remain today. I hope to demonstrate the value of returning to Munk. Per Margaret Cohen and Franco Moretti, the great unread that has escaped canonization, especially translations, whether in distant or close readings, can shed light on the development of vernacular literatures and the uneven relations between them. And while the work of Cohen, Sama Selim, and Elisa Marti Lopez, among others, has shown that works of popular fiction like the mysteries genre and the sentimental novel exist in a supplemental relationship to more canonical fiction, works like Munk's deserve to be read in their own right, as more than mere seedbeds, critical foils, or challenges to high literature. As Chona Shmeruk claimed in his pioneering study of Schund, a label which one could only anachronistically apply to Munk, the history of Schund is too often the history of the struggle against it. Moreover, Munk's text stages an encounter with what Pascal Casanova has infamously called the central meridian of the world literary system, Paris as the hegemonic hub, sending French literature from within for global translation abroad, and canonizing literature from abroad by translating it into French. This centrality of Paris was eminently known to Sue's Jewish translators, from the celebratory front matter of Schumann's Hebrew translation to the brief original introduction to the second Yiddish translation of Les Mystères, Die Geheimnisse von Paris, by Johann Joine Palais from the 1890s, which will be the focus of the second half of my presentation today. Palais' Paris is die Stadt von wannen alle Modes werden gebracht und von wannen alle zivilisierte Länder lernen der Eretz Ideen und Hochme, der viel geläubter Paris. A comparative look at Munk and Palais thus offers us a case study for how Jewish literatures entered the capital W world, however mediated, unknown, or forgotten that entrance might have been. And as an instance of retranslation spanning 30 years, these texts also shed light on the diachronic development of Yiddish translational norms, first at the moment of the emergence of popular fiction in Warsaw, and then during what critic B. Goren called Die Meluche von Schund in New York, once the mysteries of formula had become reified. Sue's novel, first serialized in 1842, 1843, had near universal appeal in France. For the bourgeoisie, the novel offered an exotic panorama of what Sue called France's internal savages. For the suffering proletariat, the humanizing portraits of the poor constituted the succor of representation. For liberals and socialists, the novel became a forum for discussing programs of uplift. For all these groups and more, the central melodramatic thread was simply a riveting narrative. Serialization was a determinative force in the success of the novel, positioned at the nexus of a dynamic process of production, dissemination, and consumption, replete with public greetings, fan fiction, and countless letters sent to Sue with suggestions for future installments or confessions of personal travails. Translations of the novel were undertaken immediately across Europe. Within a year, there were 6 English editions, 5 German, and 1 each in Russian and Polish. The mere title had such currency that the formula Mysteries of X and X of Paris birthed many spin-offs. And in all of the markets it entered, the novel produced a critical backlash. Marx, Belinsky, Poe, others variously objected to the novel as a sad symbol of the commodification of belles-lettres and or petit bourgeois neo-Christian mystification of materialist class tensions, notwithstanding Sue's own socialist credentials, and or a bad ripoff of Dickens. To read Belinsky on Sue is to read Sue's Mishpet avant la lettre. Given Sue's ubiquity, it is not surprising that he made his way into Hebrew. It is a bit curious that Schulman, known as a moderate conservative maskil, would undertake it, though we must recall that Sue's popularity was in part due to the sheer multiplicity of the text, what Sue himself referred to as a récit multiple. Excuse me, I'm not a native French speaker in front of many natives, so it's a bit off. But if there was something for everyone, so too could there be something appropriable for maskilic ends. The translation's front matter reveals as much. Breathless apostrophes to the Hebrew language, which frame the translation as nothing more and nothing less than proof to both Jews and perhaps even more so Gentiles of the vitality and worldliness of the ancient universal tongue. The runaway success of Schulman's translation, owing to its biblicized but not over-Judaized register, the novelty of the plot and setting, and the view it offered of princes, prostitutes, and the proletariat beyond the pale, provoked no small amount of consternation. The charge was led by Avraham Mapu, whose foundational novels Love of Zion and The Hypocrite were vastly outsold by Mystères Paris. Mapu went so far as to liken the translation to an intermarriage, a biting addition to a centuries-old constellation of gendered translation metaphors. This rhetoric was as much a sign of Mapu's anxiety of influence as it was of the stronghold Schulman and Sue had over readers. It also reveals the outsized stakes of the debate over the desirability, possibility, form, and content of the translated and original Hebrew novel. The belief that the wrong kind of writing could be a kind of national betrayal for a young literature would resurface in Yiddish several decades later, as we have already seen. It is back to Yiddish that we now turn. In his studies of popular Yiddish literature, David Roskies has taught us that the Meisebichel chapbook, both in its traditional and maskilic format, was a routine vehicle from the turn of the 19th century for the translation and popularization of a wide range of native and foreign fare, often mediated through Hebrew and always through a conservative but flexible didacticization apparatus known as the Musar crucible. The protean nature of the Meisebichel in the age of Yiddish popular fiction meant that no zero-sum dynamic between religious and secular, between Judaization and Europeanization, or even between elite and mass male and female audiences ever held sway. These are mutually constitutive currents in flux within and between works. Some version of this flux was likewise present within Sue's novel. The roots of the mysteries genre lie in medieval chronicles of the meek and poor having privileged access to the mysteries of Christ and his saints. Sue's breakthrough was to transpose this structure onto the world of the omnipotent princely Rudolph and the downtrodden he helped to save. See here, page 5, for the pseudo-religious cover of the first English edition. It is possible that this was a usable and maybe even legitimating brew both for Hebrew and Yiddish literature's mid-century, productively straddling religious tradition and secular modernity. The publishing context of Munch's translation is witness to this dialectic. Warsaw was the site of an emergent Yiddish literary market. A survey of the Levinson publishing house under which Munch's work appeared reveals contemporary publications that represent the full breadth of Jewish letters, from bilingual Passover Haggadahs to Hebrew works on astronomy, to Dick's exotic romances, to Mendel's landmark Dos Windschwingerl. Munch's work appeared simultaneously with translations of Italian robber bandit stories and 2 works bearing the Mysteries title. One, a pseudo-traditional poem, partly in the voice of a heretic, describing the mysteries of the world to come, and the second, a Hebrew translation of the German Jewish historian Hermann Reckendorf's popularized account of Jewish history. Reckendorf's Geheimnisse der Juden was explicitly modeled on Sue's episodic structure and no doubt borrowed the title to maximize its marketability. The Hebrew translation followed suit. We thus might imagine 2 axes of Hebrew legitimation for Munch's translation, See page 6 for my attempt to represent this graphically, a single French text acting as a centripetal force for 5 others in Yiddish, Hebrew, and German. Though we can better understand Munch's translation through its relation to other texts, the evidentiary record for who exactly Munch was is thin. See all these citations. None of these attestations tie Munch to works outside of the traditional rabbinic canon in Hebrew and Yiddish, but there is kol minei svarim, all kinds of books that might be vague enough to leave space for Sue. A note on the source space as we turn to Munch's translation. As you can see here, excluded from this triangle are the possibly mediating translations that shaped Munch's translation beyond Schulman's Hebrew, that is Polish and Russian. The glosses Munch uses throughout his translation draw from both languages, which might indicate such a reliance. The case of Schulman is much clearer. His glosses draw exclusively from German. Insofar as Munch could not help but translate against the German-inflected Hebrew, so too does German enter Munch's field. Much linguistic work remains to be done in incorporating Polish and Russian sources. In limiting myself to French, German, and Hebrew, suffice it to say that my conclusions are always a bit tentative. To begin with the front matter, whereas the elaborate apologetics for the modern worldly use of Hebrew course through each of the introductions to the 4 volumes of Schulman's translation, and whereas contemporary Yiddish translations of world literature likewise contain their own prefaces defending the use of Yiddish to maskilim, addressing imagined audiences, and pointing up the moral takeaways of the translated story, nothing of the sort appears in Munch. There is no complex about the suitability or adaptability either of the source text or the Yiddish language to convey it, just as there is no complex about the audiences a Yiddish version was and was not intended for. With all the caution of an argument from silence, one conclusion is that the goal here is simply to present a narrative, a tacit if unknowing nod to the protean nature of Sue's original that allowed readers of all stripes to take from the text what they wished. And if we turn back to the title page, we might find vectors of marketability for a variety of readerships. The borrowing of Schulman's Hebrew title, in addition to the translated from French, would appeal to maskilim who already knew of Schulman's blockbuster and or were attracted to the cultural capital of a French text. While the text itself does suggest that Munch translated directly from French, it is a mistake either to accept this paratextual designation prima facie or to assume that the translation's declared proximity to the original was inherently valued by Yiddish and Hebrew readers, long reared on mediated translations and anyway indifferent to the precise source if the story was good and well domesticated. The omission of Sue's name from the title page, a scandal to readers of translations today, was likewise fairly conventional for the time. Hebrew readers who were slumming with Munch would have known it was Sue anyway from the success of Schulman, whose introduction also included Sue's biography. And for other readers, the identity or cultural capital of the author was again secondary to the narrative itself. The primacy of the narrative becomes clear in Munch's Vorrede, that's here, while Sue's novel introduces us to the main characters as they are already embroiled in overlapping intrigues, purposely delaying revelation of all their backstories. Munch, in his introduction, reconstructs the plot chronologically, fearlessly dispensing spoilers for which French and Hebrew readers would have to wait hundreds of pages. The biggest spoiler of them all is the central mystery of the novel, and here I apologize, that the young woman whom Prince Rudolph saves from the clutches of a criminal known as Slasher at the beginning of the novel is in fact Rudolph's long-lost daughter Amélie, whom he thought to be dead. Imagine Citizen Kane opening with the scene of the rosebud. Munch undoes here the central mechanism of Sue's trademark aesthetic, narrativizing the totality of the labyrinthine metropolis through multiple threads across time and space, replete with all the melodramatic devices of cliffhangers, endless deferrals, sudden reversals, and so on. I would advance 2 explanations for Munch's embrace of spoilers beyond helping his readers to, quote, get a feel for the story. First, recapping the story from the very beginning allows Munch to begin with a nugget of Musar. The lost daughter is born only because her mother believes a prophecy that shacking up with a prince will ensure her future wealth. The moral of not falling victim to superstition was as suitable for traditional rabbinic deployment as it was for a masculine critique of irrational religious praxis. Second, Munch's revelation may be nothing more than an implicit acknowledgement that genre fiction is so successful because, not despite, its predictability. Knowing that Sherlock Holmes will solve the case need not lessen our appreciation for how he did so. In this sense, Munch may be sober about the limits of maintaining readerly suspense. Even Sue himself was forced to reveal the mystery of the lost daughter a third of the way in. That's here. And you can see if you want to skip ahead to the Palais version of that passage as well. To zoom out a bit, I cannot marshal all the evidence here, but the most obvious difference between Munch and Sue is length. Munch's 125 chapters compared to Sue's 167 generally follows the cues of Schulman's abridgments, reduced attention to tertiary characters, abbreviated erotic scenes, and minimal coverage of Sue's many digressions into the politics of penal reform and philanthropy. The result is a concerted, consistent attempt to reduce the plot to its mechanistic developments. The narrative, as in the prologue, reigns supreme. A more granular accounting of the chapter titles, this is on the next 3 pages, but I'll let you browse at your leisure, offers a window onto Munch's style within the text. In addition to French character and place names, in adhering to French character and place names, whether by transcription, translation, or some combination of both, Munch routinely demonstrates his independence from Schulman, whose tendency is to find biblical equivalents in sound or meaning. Even the use of Lashon Kodesh in Munch diverges from that of Schulman. For instance, Louise is transcribed and then glossed as Leah rather than Bosmat. A priestly figure is Koime rather than Koyen. And where Schulman's glosses, always into German, are reserved for footnotes, Munch inscribes miniature acts of translation and explanation within the chapter titles and body of the text itself, drawing on the full range of Hebraic, Germanic, and Slavic elements of Yiddish, a natural enough device for anyone reared on the Taich of Cheder. I will only highlight my favorite of this ilk. I think that's
I'm sure that in a moment we will resume the lecture. Let's just wait for probably just internet problem. I don't know if we have the time, but if you have any remarks, no? Tal, do you?
No,
Hi.
Oh,
sorry
great.
here.
sorry. Maybe someone else can share their screen. I think that might be part of the problem on my end.
I can do it.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, so my favorite is the Latin Fumens Amoris, crazy in love, becomes Cholas Ahava, die Mishugas von Liebe, right? So you can see he draws on the full range of, in that translation, of just 2 words in Latin. I now turn to the first chapter on the assumption that Munch was at his freshest and most dedicated to any translation principles at the work's inception. The first chapter is also the richest in slang in the original. Sue quickly admits to his readers that he decides to forego overloading subsequent chapters with slang and class-differentiated speech in the name of accessibility. I have summarized the main points on pages 14 through 16. Munch again travels much closer to the French realia. Of particular note are Munch's attempts to capture the slangy jibes of the slasher and the disguised Prince Rudolph as they come to blows and then reconcile. These attempts vary in success. Sometimes the idioms are flattened or the sense of differentiated language is lost. In other cases, it truly sings. In a moment of performativity, the slasher notes that Rudolph is speaking slang by using a term for slang, divider le jar, literally emptying the jars. While Munch is unable to carry this meta slang over, opting instead for the explicit Du sprichst ganevische Sprache, Munch's literal rendition of Compere mer as Vitate Mame just might work, insofar as the mix of Dad's Lashon Kodesh and Mom's earthy Yiddish could be construed as a kind of Jewish slang.
Just tell me the page number if you want me to move to the page.
Okay, yeah, I will. If you go, I think it's 15 or 16, you can see the, maybe 16. Yeah, you can see the attempt to translate.
Ouais. Tu divides.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I will now turn briefly to 2 short final passages before turning to Palais' retranslation. The first is the single moment in Sue's novel where the word Jew appears in the middle of a confession of a degenerate gambler and dandy to his estranged father. This is page 17. The casual use of juive as a shorthand for moneylenders is nothing out of the ordinary for mid-century France. Munch translates juives as milue ribis, glossed with procentnikes. The whitewashing of anti-Semitic elements in Gentile texts would be a common feature of Yiddish translations for the next half century. And it wasn't until the interwar period when norms for fidelity would prevail over an understandable impulse to clean up the original. While we should be cautious about associating ruthless fidelity with literary maturity, the longstanding hesitance to translate even casual, ambient anti-Semitism is a useful lens onto the contingent modernization of Yiddish letters. The second passage is the very end of Munch's translation, in which he condenses a tenth of Sue's novel into a single page. This is page 18, where Sue devotes chapters to Amelie's fraught journey to nunhood, her inability to forgive herself for her past life of sin, her refusal of a suitor and tragic death, all told in heartrending epistolary form. Munch radically telegraphs the events to their bare facts. This near comical abridgment, useful though it is as an example of Munch's style, might be as much a sign of Munch's hesitancy about delving into such Christian material as it is of pure fatigue. While the mostly warm reception of Schulman's translation is reflected in several memoirs, I have yet to find evidence of Munch's staying power. This is hardly to say that Sue himself was not a presence in Yiddish letters, even prior to his appearance in Schomer's Mishpat. See page 19. In Pesach David Engelstein's 1868 serialized drama, Die Verfrorene Blote, Die Geheimnisse von Paris is listed along with Campe and Defoe as the curriculum of a nihilist teacher who spreads his pseudo-Maskilic Torah, allegedly learned from these authors, that love is nothing but an invented custom. The modern Melamed, who has read Sue, presumably in Russian translation, according to Dahlia Kaufman's reading of the play, is satirized as nothing more than a parrot. In a more positive light, on page 20, David Ruskies recently drew my attention to a mention of Sue in a footnote of Isaac Mayer Dick, for whom Sue's Paris, in all of its class-specific differentiated speech, becomes a model for Dick's native Vilna. One final trace of Sue's mysteries will bring us yet closer to the second translation of Palais. In Shalom Aleicham's Die Jüdische Volksbibliothek, this is page 21, which along with Schomer's Mishpat can be taken as a kind of manifesto for the new Yiddish literature, Shalom Aleichem imagined, we find a partial translation of Hermann Reckendorf's Jewish historical spin-off of Sue, Die Geheimnisse der Juden. In the same year that this Yiddish translation of the Mysteries of the Jews appeared, Johann Palais, the future translator of the Mysteries of Paris, made it to New York, where he would soon befriend none other than Shalom Aleicham's foil, Schomer himself, who had also arrived in 1888. This textual and interpersonal web, tied together with the mysteries genre in all of its adaptability, hints at the transatlantic element of the story, that popular literature, which would come to be labeled as Schund by its detractors, had its own parallel career in America and would go on to affect European markets well into the ensuing decades. A few words about Palais. Born in 1871, in the Minsker Gubernia, he received a traditional education, enrolled in the Volozhin Yeshiva, and then grew itinerant, a rabbinical seminary in Lipave, back home, Kovne, Moscow, where he seems to have converted to Christianity. Along the way, Palais studied German, other languages, and even prepared to travel to France to study. Russian tyranny ultimately proved too much for him. On the ship to America, he wrote his first novel, Die Russische Helden, and successfully submitted it to the new paper Der Volksadvokat for a hefty honorarium. He became editor soon thereafter, and a steady stream of contributions to the Volksadvokat included a translation of Mapu's Hypocrite, Ayat Savua, and analyzed in depth by Shmuel Versus. According to Versus, Palais, part of a generation of late Maskilim, alternately eager and compelled to make their living through the American Yiddish press, was perhaps drawn to the Sue-like elements of melodrama in Mapu's novel. Palais would found and contribute to other newspapers in the subsequent years, eventually becoming the editor of Saracen's Orthodox Yiddisches Tageblatt, founded 1885, which remained a hegemon of the anti-radical, also anti-Fauverts press. As editor, Palais was known for his opportunism and sensationalism, leveraging both Dreyfus and Kishinev for circulation boosts, manufacturing the craziest stories for publication, and most mildly, hosting card games with Schomer in the office. Palais's large stature in the Yiddish press is attested to not only by the opulent home he purchased in the then new neighborhood of Borough Park, but also by the coverage of his death in 1907. See page 22. Front page obituaries, funeral notices, and reports in several newspapers, even the rival Fauverts, a poetic tribute by Naftali Herz-Imber, a eulogy delivered by Tzvi Hirsch-Masliansky, a wreath from Y.L. Magnus. There was even a touch of the sensational and mysterious around Palais's death. first reported as a heart attack and later by both Schomer's daughter and Zalman Reyshe as a suicide by gas intoxication. Paley's translation of Sue came in the mid-1890s in the full swing of the so-called Heften epidemia in New York, as chronicled by Eliyahu Shulman, Yosef Chaikin, Shmeruk, and my fellow panelist Ellen Kellman. This wave was set off by none other than an iteration of the mystery genre. Avner Tannenbaum's 1892 free translation of a German chapbook titled Die Geheimnisse von Russischen Kaiserlichen Hof, page 23. This is a later reprint. 81 pamphlets of 16 pages each appeared over 4 months, enriching Tannenbaum and publishers Kantrovich and Saperstein and inspiring dozens of spin-offs. The Heften, frequently loose translations of European literature, which the translators at turns domesticated and improved, took the American market by storm, notwithstanding the critical backlash. See page 24 for B. Goren's retrospective volley, reminiscent of the charges of mimicry leveled against Schomer by Sholem Aleichem, particularly this language of übergesetzt, übergemacht, übergenitzevit is almost verbatim from Schomer's Mishpat. And though the Heften were soon eclipsed by serialized fiction within the newspapers, they found second life in reprints both at home and in particular abroad, where the mass market Yiddish press lagged. See page 25 for an advertisement of Paley's translation in Warsaw's Hatzfira. I wonder what it would have been like for Munch to read this, that there's a new translation of the very work he translated. How Paley arrived precisely at the translation of Sue is not clear, but roughly simultaneously with the serialized translation of Mapu, Paley put out a novel entitled Das Leben in Amerika oder Die Geheimnisse von New York. It stands to reason that some brew of curiosity about this genre's origin and a hunch about its literary and most important market viability led to the decision to take on Les Mystères. The volume has come down to us in 2 undated reprints, first from Verbelovsky and second from Hebrew Publishing Company. Traces of the Heften format remain on the bottom of the first reprint, each installment labeled with Paris in English letters, followed by numbers up to 45. I think this is on page 26. Yeah. I found 19 listings, advertisements for these collected Heften and book reprints in catalogs in the press from 1897 to 1928. If this might be a sign of the longue durée reception of Paley's translation, it could likewise be a sign of a desire to liquidate unread inventory at various periods. Later advertisements offer the novel along with other works by Paley, translated in original, for decreasing prices, half-price sales, and so on. We can now finally turn to Paley's translation. Like Munch, heavy abridgment and condensation are the name of the game. 69 chapters, nearly 100 less than the original, but it ends up being much longer than Munch's. But with the same preference for shortening long conversations, doing away with peripheral strands of the plot, and so on. After stricter adherence to the first dozen or so chapters, Paley's abridgments increase over the course of the novel, such that the last 30 chapters in the original are covered in 10 by Paley. Selected chapter titles on pages 26 and 27 allow us to highlight several basic qualities of his style. First, a tendency to translate names rather than preserve the French original. Second, Deutschmerisch register relative to Munch that ends up mirroring, whether intentionally or not, the German translation. Paley's penchant for German, which it should be said was also a function of its time and place, even has him outdoing the German, as in his translation of Tempelstrasse, where the German preserves Rue du Temple. Third, and relatedly, a seeming reliance on the Schulman translation and chapter titles that depart from the French and the German, this in comparison to Munch's autonomy from Schulman. Fourth, minimal but effective use of Lashon Kodesh. There's really one example there in Dalet on page 27. And finally, in areas of abridgment where Paley's original chapter titles cover the ground of several of Sue's, there's a tendency to slightly exculpate the plot, not to the point of spoilers, but yes, to the point of building extra suspense. So you get die Fischfangennetz, gefallenen Netz, and so on. Okay. A close reading of Paley's style can be made on the basis of the first chapter. See the next 4 or 5 pages. I'll leave it to you to look at this on your own time, but just to highlight a couple of things. First, there's a variety of attempts of varying success to render the earthy register of the criminal underclass. That can be through Lashon Kodesh, the occasional amplification of Sue's descriptions, or the punchy Anglicism, reminding us that Paley's translation was read on Delancey and Canal. While Paley, at least in the beginning of his translation, is indeed more committed to representing this slang than Munch is, he is not above simple omission to get around the challenge. You can see that if you go, I think, towards maybe 31, 32. 32. Yeah, especially in the last one where he totally omits the kind of religious slang at the end. Second, well, the omission of French details that serve to make Sue's text slightly more mobile, delivering the plot without all the color of the original. So you can see Jack Turner is replaced by Feiter, and these landmarks in Paris are just Ganz Paris. This is all in keeping with the domesticating norms of the Heften translations of the time. Third is the enshrinement of German, evident earlier from the translation of chapter titles. This becomes explicit at the end of the first chapter, where instead of the English referenced in Sue's original, it is translated into German by Paley. This is on page 33. I think it, yeah. So you can see en anglais becomes in deutscher Sprache. If in Sue's original, the English seems to be framed as a high, princely, and slightly mysterious register for the protagonist Rudolph, then the transposition to German does indeed appear to be the best choice, as a straight copying of English would not have had the same alterity in 1890s New York as it did in 1840s Paris. Nevertheless, given the generally Germanized register of many other characters throughout Paley's translation, this initial transposition muddies the waters and points to the limits of what Paley could achieve. Before concluding, just a note on the very end of Paley's translation on page 34, like Munch, Paley drastically abridges the subplot of Rodolphe's daughter repenting for her past prostitution and assuming her royal title as Princess Amélie. But Paley does devote several pages to the heart-wrenching and overwrought conversation between father and daughter over the daughter's desire to enter a monastery. This is Monastir. Rudolph eventually gives in, and Paley renders the news of the princess, who is now named Miriam, I guess a translation of Marie, renders the news of her assuming the veil. By translating La prise de voile as Leben abgesondert von der Welt, Paley both sidesteps the problem of translating a Christian idiom and highlights Rudolph's earlier lament that in Monastir heißt es Teut vor der Welt und Leben auf jener Welt. And it is here that Paley's translation ends, omitting any mention of Amelie's deteriorating health in the monastery, the guilt and shame overtaking her body and soul to the point of actual martyrdom. It was precisely this neo-Christian element of the finale for which Marx so excoriated Sue. Paley's decision to stop short of describing or even mentioning Miriam's death may be chalked up to what Versus sees as his anti-clerical tendencies in his translation of Mapu. Here, mere entrance into the monastery is already a kind of death. But this scene may also be a product of the high stakes Paley attributed to conversion from Judaism, given what we know of his own conversion and return to no less than the Orthodox stronghold of the Tageblatt. Right, this discourse of if you go to the monastery, you'll die is almost like if you convert, you're dead to me. That's the kind of feeling. Just a few remarks in conclusion. While Munch's translation likely needed Schulman's Hebrew precedent to see the light of day, this fact did not mandate any adherence to it. The circumstances of Munch's seeming knowledge of French and mid-century Yiddish's greater openness to linguistic alterity and fusion, in fact, allowed for meaningful departures from the Hebrew, even as Munch leveraged the Lashon Kodesh component to appropriately heightening effect. And while Munch's proximity to the French source is notable, even anomalous for its time, the rule of thumb being mediated translations, this fact is only enticing to us 21st century readers who privilege accuracy and readability in more or less equal measure. The fidelity of Munch's French-inflected Yiddish did little to nothing to secure his place in the canon relative to Schulman's Hebrew, as sure a sign as any for the conditions of possibility for Yiddish literature in the 1860s. Paley's retranslation is anchored in a different linguistic landscape, in which the ideal of German was a consistent operating principle and Lashon Kodesh was used as a pointed, earthy contrast. Paley's translation testifies both to the ephemerality of the Yiddish book market, he seems not to have translated with Munch in mind, and to the widespread and enduring appeal of Sue's novel and the mystery genre it ushered in. Recall that Paley's translation was being marketed as late as 1928. And I have counted no fewer than 22 titles with Geheimnisse in WorldCat from 1869 to 1911. A fuller study of this complex is in order, as is a consideration of the Jewish reception of Sue more generally, particularly his blockbuster novel, which followed Les Mystères, that is Le Juif Errant, 1844, translated into Hebrew from 1866 to 73, and into Yiddish in 1898, reaching a 7th edition by 1927. The novel's explicitly Christian orientation make a study of its Jewish translations particularly enticing. Even the small moments of negotiating Jewish and Christian material in Les Mystères can reveal much about the norms of Munch's and Palais' time. In this sense, many, if not all, of the desiderata in Schmeruk's landmark article on Schund remain. This is on page 35. Keeping in mind Sama Salim's remark that Sue's Paris became an open signifier for popular literature the world over, and Borges's masterful definition of a source text as a, quote, movable event, I leave you with the words of one-time Sue rival Balzac from Père Goriot, which made it into the Yiddish translation by David Svard, Vilna, 1937. Yes, page 36, at a time when abridgment was no longer a dominant translational norm. In any case, I hope I have at least encouraged you to become one of Balzac's literarische Teuchers, however oceanic the field may be. Thank you. Or merci, I should say.
Thank you so much, Joshua. It was a fascinating talk. I also wish to thank our previous speaker, Ellen Kellman, who is not with us. And we will have a discussion that will include both questions and remark about the two present talks and about the previous talks of the day. And the discussion will be led by Arnaud.
Thank you, Sharon. I think we should begin with asking Joshua questions about his talk. If I may, I will ask something. I was very curious about Munch, and if you have any idea how he got his knowledge of French, and I guess it's difficult to know, but his knowledge of French, if I've understood well, you infer from the remnants of the French language in the translation, yeah.
Right. I think I'd also have to, well, my Polish is non-existent. So I think we'd really have to look at the Polish to see, because Munch probably knew Polish. And so we'd have to look to see if the Polish version also keeps the French elements, in which case maybe he just based himself on the Polish.
Yeah, that might be an option, but French might also be possible. But which is very strange is he was a rabbi as well, you said, but he was like a Kron rabbi, or you.
It's not. Yeah, it's pretty scant.
Okay.
He had a bookstore that and published various things afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah.
We don't have much knowledge about him at all. You said only two exemplaries of his book have been kept.
Yeah, there's one in Israel and one HUC, I think.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah. But I scanned it if anyone wants it. So.
Thank you. I might
Sure.
want
I think Saul wants to.
Yeah, Saul wants to ask something.
I happen to have a copy of it in my office. This is Mr. Whatever, the Sue novel. It's very thick. So you talked a little bit about how it was.
I have it too.
Yeah, how it was. I have not read it. I did take it out of the library, but I have not read it. Talked about the way the shortening worked. And how important that kind of like consolidation was. How much did that have to do with assumed readership? So I'm talking about reading as prestige. I know this is an impossible question because it's about reception. So you'd want to read the novel to be able to identify and understand the term Mystères, or Geheimnis. That's sort of an important literary term to know, but you wouldn't necessarily read the whole thing, or even the writers themselves wouldn't want to translate the whole thing. Is there something to simply being able to identify and make legible the genre itself in Yiddish more important than actually constructing the whole thing? That seems to be what I'm hearing from you. In some way, there's a kind of prestige to actually publishing more than reading itself.
Yeah, prestige is a tricky term because so much of this seems motivated by market interests. But yes, I think especially with something that basically marks itself as a translation rather than the mysteries of fill in the blank, that this is like back to the original, it's less important. It has worth like sort of more symbolically because we already have our own mysteries. So this seems to be a kind of after the fact, let's complete the set maybe with the original one. But yeah, it's a slog. I mean, I still haven't made it through all of the chapters and all the versions, and yeah.
One question, well, two more questions, one from Naomi, please.
Thank you. And thank you for a really wonderful paper. The detail here with the text is really impressive. One thing I'm curious about is the format of the text and the publication, because Sue's text, I think, is innovative for its time because not only how the text is constructed, but how it is built and it is published in serial format in a way that engages the audience. And that at least Sue claims that he gets letters and he changes the plot perhaps and various things. It's a very different way of publishing fiction that I think does take the French market by storm. Now, that I don't think is possible in the same way for Munch in the time in which he's publishing, but it seems to perhaps be a bit more possible for Palais later on when he's publishing. So I'm wondering if you want to reflect, given the wonderful details you've brought to us about this text, how the historical context and the conditions of publication might impact the texts themselves.
Yeah, I think this would be good to look at with the so-called the looser mysteries adaptations, right? Where there's less of an initial commitment to this already made text. But I don't know if there's an analog for like Palais getting letters or letters to the Tageblatt that talk about, I mean, we'd have to look. My sense is that it's not that robust and that it's a lot of times the initiative of the sort of hack work of the adapter translator, responding to what has previously sold well and putting his own spin on it. But yeah, I mean, the Heften are for a brief time, the format is incredibly important, right? Even more than the content for 3 years or whatever.
I think Tal has one
that's my
question.
question. So thank you so much, Joshua. Sorry, that was really fascinating talk. I love Mystères de Paris. I gave my father a tour in Paris with the Kellman Schulman. We used it as a yeah, it was mind blowing. Anyway, so I have a question. I was actually looking for references in Yiddish or in Hebrew or by Jews around Schulman, or I was not aware of the translations to the criticism of Marx and Engels in the Heilige Familie of Mystères de Paris. Yeah, it's so classical for Marxists, and so many Jews were Marxists. So I'm wondering, maybe you, who actually worked on it, found any trace of any reference to Marx and Engels' criticism of Eugène Sue. Would love to cite it if you have something.
Not yet. I mean, there's like memoiristic accounts by Dubnov and Achad Ha'am of reading Schulman, but I don't think it goes beyond that.
So the entire class mystification or class reading, maybe not mentioning Marx, but just looking at this text as from a class perspective, did you find any kind of commentary?
Not yet. I mean, so far I've just been focused on the translations themselves. Sure. But I mean, definitely with Munch, I don't think there's anything around it. yeah, to be determined with Palais. But
The frustration continues. Thank you.
There might be something in the Veviorka, like Soviet book about Shund. I haven't called Revizie. I can send you the PDF of that. There might be more in there about it, though I don't know.
Sounds promising.
I don't know if there are more questions. I don't see.
I think Alexandra wanted to ask a question.
Alexandra.
Yes, please. And I did raise my hand, so I don't know what's wrong with my hand or with my Zoom, whatever. But anyway, Joshua, thank you for the presentation. And the question is along these lines. Today, translators often run into a situation when you do a translation and then the reader would go to the original text or go to another language translation and kind of make comments, comparisons, and so on and so forth. So my question is, how far would that be the case with Yiddish translators in terms that, is there any evidence that a reader who would read the Yiddish translation would also read the Hebrew translation or French translation or Polish translation? And if there is any if there's any recording of the translators being aware of that and somehow looking back at the alternative translations. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Jeremy Dower talks about this notion of slumming, that like when you have a Hebrew and Yiddish work of the same, that let's say elite readers just might find the Yiddish easier. I'm not sure if this is exactly what you're asking, but I would imagine that some portion of people that tried to read Schulman maybe ended up with Munch, or even because Schulman was so long lasting that once they saw Palais, they were, let's give this a try, it might be easier. I don't know if that's exactly what you're.
Yeah, that's the question, but basically the question is, how far would most of the readers be aware of the alternative text, alternative translations, or maybe the original, and how far the translators have to take that into account?
I think in general, the kind of mass readership would just stick to the trend. I mean, that's just my educated guess. But, you know, I think Don Miron talks about that was sort of a sport to compare Mendele in Hebrew and Yiddish. So maybe people did that. I don't know.
Thank you very much.
But I would say that it's very unlikely that someone would sit there with a French, apart from a critic, that a reader would sit there with a French tome and the Yiddish tome and compare notes. I think that's highly unlikely.
I think
if we keep in mind something along the lines of fandom today, when people would go into very careful textual analysis, and I'm sure with a cult novel like Mystères of Paris, that could have been the case.
Yeah. I think actually Alexandra's question can be related to when it reminded me a bit of it's another time and another problem, but when Elia Levita wrote his chivalric romances, he wrote in the introduction that he knew people would recognize, and some people would already know this story, and they would already have read it in Italian. So there might be some knowledge, diffuse knowledge, popular knowledge about these stories, but I don't think, I think they are so intricate and so complicated that they wouldn't be totally comparable to what happened with the chivalric romance in the 16th century. That's my guess. Sal has something to say.
Just to jump off that, I think there's one of the things that at least I was referring to earlier with my earlier questions about the satisfaction of recognition, reading and satisfaction, such that you're, and you mentioned this earlier, Joshua, with the idea of like giving away the plot at the beginning. There's something about, well, I already know what's going on. And that, I think that's part of one of the pleasures or the guilty pleasures of translation is that even when you're reading another mystery novel, a city mystery novel that has a totally different plot in a different city, a totally different set of concerns, you already know it. It's already been translated for you in some way, whether you've read the original Sioux version or not. There's a kind of, the chapters are arbitrary. This is what the sort of, the Yakubovich confession was about. Like, I didn't need any models anymore. The novels just sort of wrote themselves. Like, I was given a genre, and so the novel wrote itself in some sense. So there's some sort of pleasure there that we have to figure out how to measure as a translational phenomenon.
I don't know if someone has something more to say.
I think we can maybe open the discussion to all the
I think the discussion is open already. I don't know.
Hannah wanted to ask something, I believe, maybe.
Yeah.
This is for Tal, but actually it goes back to all the talks that we heard today. And that is the concept of a maitik. It's very interesting to me, the extent to which it is not associated with anything pejorative, right? Contrary the looking down at translation as secondary, the valorization of the original. Hatoke is identified with transmission, as you said beautifully, and with a preservation of tradition, which is really, I'm going to try to argue that, a very central concept. And therefore, when Yavitz himself, kind of late, I think, I understood from your presentation, kind of adopts the very kind of bourgeois capitalist idea of ownership, right, of property, kind of treating a translation or a text as property that he lays claim to with the copyright infringement statements. You know, I think, Saul, you asked, is there any evidence of his kind of Western or Europeanized education? I think those values creep in because the traditional attitude really does not foreground the name of the writer or the name of the translator or the matik, but actually the people are known by the work that they wrote, right? Der Yad Chazoke, right? Also, I'm interested whether there is a distinction between, early on, between Ma'atik and Metargem, because Turgeman appears already in rabbinic times in the Talmudic version of the synagogue. He's not a translator only, but somebody who stands physically between the congregation and the rabbi. The rabbi speaks Hebrew. The audience mostly understands Aramaic or Greek or whatever. And so this is a translation, but also an interpretation. So there must have been some kind of a nuanced distinction between the two. And I think the Maitik has more to do with the text and the Turgeman with the oral transmission, but I don't know. I haven't researched this. I only work in the modern period.
Okay, thank you so much for this question. I'll answer it. So Metargem and Meturgeman, to the best of my knowledge, of course, we could translate better as an interpret, yeah. And the usage of Metargem or Meturgeman as a translator in the sense that we use today is modern, of course. And the question is why. So you are looking for a semantic difference between Maitik and Metargem. I would actually look for...
It's actually pragmatic, not semantic. It's right, because it's
Yeah, I think it's more political. I think it
context,
has to
right?
do, my thesis or my hypothesis that demands, of course, to be proven, is that it belongs to those words that we can call translations from Loshen Kodesh to Hebrew. So basically a creation of a new vocabulary that goes away from tradition, goes away from Yiddish, goes away from Ashkenazi Hebrew, from diasporic Hebrew, and trying to create a new vocabulary in Hebrew that usually goes back either to biblical, in this case to Aramaic, and to create a sort of a distinction. So Maitik maybe belongs to the past. Metargem is a as a neologism that is actually an old term that is being reinvested in a new meaning. I think that the function of this neologism is to create a distinction, which is of course political. Yeah, a political distinction between a traditional practice and a modern practice that we can put within the broader new concept again of literature, right? There was no literature before, let's say, 19th century. So in that sense, I think that I try to avoid saying that Yavetz is working against the grain or is a translator against the grain, because I think that he is the grain and the Yiddishists, they are the anomaly in his time. But we just forgot him to such an extent that it becomes a curiosity now. This is my way of putting it.
Thank you.
Yeah, the Tibonim, of course. The Tibonim were called Ma'atikim and Ataka, of course. Yes, this is the time where the word actually is being invested with the meaning. I said Spain and Provence. Absolutely, the Tibonim is precisely that moment where it becomes a technical term, a name of a profession, Ma'atik. Yeah, it's precisely this period. So
I just didn't realize that they were known as Matikim. Okay.
Yes, of course.
As someone who lived on Rehova Tibonim, they like come to mind very often.
They were known as Matikim, but also in their own time, you find in the introductions of Ibn Tibon, you find Ha'ataka, Hadasha, Ataka Shelit. You find the vocabulary, basically they invented it. They or Ibn Ezra, it's this period anyway.
It might be linked to what Hannah just said, but there's one work of Elia Bocher, who one of his Hebrew works, which is called Ametorgeman, and he's a dictionary of Aramaic terms, which, yeah.
But this is already a joke. This is not.
No, but it has that sense of translation combined with interpretation, going back to ancient Assyria. I mean, it's an Assyrian term. That Bill Hallow wrote about years ago.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So both of them have a history. Both Ma'atik and Turgeman have a history that predates nationalism and secularization. And both may have been kind of re-signified, right? With Ma'atik getting a negative valence because it's a copy.
Ataka, yeah.
Not sure if Ma'atik became a negative term. It just became
a Solatik.
Yes, of course, in Israeli Hebrew. In Israeli Hebrew, sure.
That's what I'm saying, that in Israeli Hebrew, both Metargem and Ma'atik.
Yeah, it sounds funny.
Signified.
A Ma'atik, sure. Yeah.
I don't know if there are more remarks. Or
I think Mendel would like to ask a question.
I was just going to add on this same topic that you were discussing, that those examples you brought, Tal, of Yavetz's, copyright statements feel very, very relevant and interesting for thinking about, the value of literary translation today, and they feel relevant to discussions among literary translators, among our kind of analysis of translation today of what kind of value is ascribed to translation, and can you make a living doing it, which is still such a relevant discussion, among the Literary Translators Association. So to me, that feels productive, and especially the different frame that you mentioned, Hannah, right, of what are the traditional kind of Jewish ways of understanding the value of translation and that role, and then how that comes into contact with Western understandings of the values of translation, even if they're only in terms of, do you get paid for doing this work? And how those different value systems are, are interacting in the kind of modern period for Yiddish literature. And then I would say, that will be interesting to discuss today also when we think about how we continue to do this translation from or to Yiddish today, and under what value systems, and what do we see in the kind of labor and the creative work of the translation, and the value for community, right? And where transmission remains such a kind of crucial, of crucial importance when we're considering why we continue to translate from Yiddish today. So just that those things feel really, they feel productive. That material that you found is exciting to think about integrating it into our understandings of this kind of history of translation from and to Yiddish.
Well, one way to think about that question is, I think it's important to keep it in terms of value or worth. It's also a question of who gets the capital exactly. Like this idea, this Shidlutsky idea that we need translations, not because we need to enrich our translators or give them jobs, but because the Jewish people needs this asset of some kind. Or I'm thinking of the example of Black Lives Matter, who needs this, who gains from this performance of this translational moment. So yeah, I think about that for today too. Like, it's not just about whether, say, not to put you on the spot, whether the Yiddish Book Center can raise the money to pay the translators to get the books they want, but that the capital that they have is being used towards to gain a kind of archive or library that is supposed to have a particular kind of value. So that's where I'm coming back to. Yes, it's about money. It has an economics to it, certainly, but for whose benefit, and certainly not for the anonymous translator necessarily, and their prestige, but as it does create a kind of storehouse of value.
I think there's also, like we speak about prestige, about capital of the translator, I think that we can also speak about gaps of knowledge and the democratizing character of translations back then, let's say in the turn of the 20th century in comparison to today. I didn't have enough time to show you the debates of rabbis, whether it is okay to translate Ein Yankov or not, debates that seem to echo the Reformation, right? Like questions of, should the simpletons be granted a translation in the vernacular of the religious texts or not? And there's something I think, like translating into Yiddish at the time, and this is not just for religious texts, but of course also for texts that we would deem as world literature. This was water for the thirsty. This was something that was completely necessary for masses of readers. And if we compare this and the economy that this creates to today, and the question of salvaging Yiddish culture through translating it into English and so on, I don't think that there's much room for comparison, in my opinion. I think that economically, yeah, it's completely different. It's completely different, and the functions that translation, you said it like middle, yeah. And now, for example, Yiddish into English, right? It's like maybe we should ask what kinds of texts are being translated into Yiddish today, so Hasidic readers will be able to access them. That might be a more easy, like a better comparison, in my opinion, if we look at 100 years ago. Yeah.
I don't know if there's still someone.
I had a small idea. I don't know if it's worth much of it's not really a question, but thinking of the different talks that we heard today, in light of Saul's talk, I thought that it might be interesting to think about comparing the Derech HaShas and theory of constructing Yiddish, and in relation with the construction of, so to say, classic Yiddish with the Nusach Mendele, and a variation of that maybe of also a different kind of way of seeing the construction of Yiddish as a derech ha-taich, and then the other ways of constructing Yiddish literature as also the Nusach taich, which is interesting and can be maybe applied to different texts that we talked about today, in particular for your talk, Tal, but I think also other examples.
Oh, just quick comment. I think, Tal, I feel like we've talked about this before, but the idea of nusach itself is a Bialik term.
Yeah,
right.
I mean,
it's his invention. He wants to canonize Mendel's nusach. So I would push back and say that taich is not a nusach.
Sure.
You know, and Yiddish doesn't have nischoes in that same way.
It's Starkman in 47 saying that Yavetz preserves the nusach of the limed, and he, of course, thinks at the back of his head there's the Bialik text of
and
Mendel.
Bialik is talking about Mendel's Hebrew and not about his
Hebrew.
Yiddish. So the Yiddishists afterwards say that the nusach, no, it's not the Hebrew. It's the, anyways, there's a competition about whose grandfather, you know, Mendel might actually be. So that I just push back against that just very quickly.
Just a last question, Tal. What was Schulman's intention in defending Yavetz in 47? You say the
Hartman.
Oh yes.
I heard Schulman. I thought you should.
Yeah.
Joshua. Sorry, Joshua. So what was his intention?
Yeah.
It's interesting. Starkman was also on the board of the lexicon, the new lexicon, right? He was a co-editor, and I think he noticed that he noticed that the article is too small, too little detail. He probably, it's not the article in the lexicon is not authored. We don't know who there are no initials, so probably it was the redaction, right? So he probably saw it and probably collected some information. He writes in a couple of footnotes. He gives credit to Yoffe and others who lent him their Ivretite collection. And he just noticed that, I mean, he did the same thing that I did, or I did the same thing that he did. Like there's a protestation here, right? We speak about so many grand figures who created modern Yiddish literature, and this person who really produced a sea of books that were read so intensively. I'm talking about really hundreds of thousands of yearly print in the beginning. Yeah, I found an article saying that like I think from the 40s that now only 300 copies are printed a year of one book, and like comparing it to how the Yerides Adoires, yeah. So so I think that Starkman was just wanted to
he was mostly a scholar.
Starkman?
Yeah.
Starkman, I don't know. I'm not an expert on Starkman.
I think this also it comes in the same time period as there's a rehabilitation of a number of religious figures into Yiddish, like you know, the sort of the right-wing traditionalism, I'd say right-wing traditionalism of the forwards starting in the 30s, but are also into the 40s. That this is a time of the closing of the ranks, anyway. So those who you can save, you save them, especially in an encyclopedia project, I would say.
His article is from Yiddish-speaking. Maybe I didn't.
That's why I was so curious, because Yiddish-speaking sounds like a left-wing.
And maybe there are better experts on Starkman here. I don't know. Actually,
I don't know. I don't know the man. That's why I was asking.
I just mentioned, just in case people didn't see the chat, that Ross Perlin translated a whole collection of Starkman's essays. So he's probably
Wow.
Okay.
he wrote one piece for Ingeved, but I know he's he translated that whole collection, so was in the head of the man.
So he was the culture tour I was looking for.
Yeah. Look what we do. We speak about Starkman, not about Yavitz.
Yeah.
I'm the right-wing
That's a
conservative.
discretion. I don't know if someone wants to add something, but I'm really happy of today's meeting and conference. It was really great, and I thank you, everyone. We have a fascinating talks together, and I'm very, very impatient to meet you tomorrow and then to continue and deepen all what we said today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
See you tomorrow.
Dank.
Have a good night.
Hello?
Yeah.
Thanks, Morgan.
Sorry, I have a small announcement for tomorrow. Unfortunately, we have some. Well, Alec Frankel will not be able to give his talk due to personal reasons, and so we will have only 2 talks during the first session. Yes, the talk of Gennady Streich and of Olga Vinogradova. It's just well, we will note it as in the program, but.
Okay.
So is it possible to start a little bit later? Because for me, it's 6 o'clock in the morning. Since
Well,
we only have 2.
I think that yes. What do you think, Arnaud, Tal, Sharon? If we started at
We can start half an hour later.
We could do that if there's a way to send a message to everyone, because I know and not everyone is here. So some people, if the information, I don't know if Brian is still here.
Brian is here.
Yeah.
Just to update, other changes have been made.
Yeah, but apart from the program, maybe we could send a message. I don't know if it's.
I can send an email. That's
okay, thank you very much,
Thank
Brian.
you, Brian. Well,
Okay,
I'm
sure.
very sorry for this, but it's really something, an emergency.
So tomorrow 3:30 Paris time.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Good. Thank you, everybody.
Okay.
Danke gesund,
Bis morgen.
Bis morgen.
Bis morgen.